He was more than a soldier. He was a symbol, the perfect instrument of 100 years of war and hatred. General Lyron's entire life was forged in the belief that orcs were monsters, and his final duty of the day was to execute one. The order was absolute, his heart was stone, and his resolve was unbreakable. He was the blade of his people, ready to deliver a justice that was swift, clean, and unquestionable. But justice is a simple thing until you look it in the eyes. In the cold silence of a dungeon, a single glance was all it took to shatter a century of conviction. The prisoner he was sent to kill was not the beast of his nightmares, but the impossible answer to a question he never knew his soul was asking. Now, he faces a choice that will cost him everything: his honor, his people, his life. But this story isn't about a simple choice between love and duty. What if their instant, impossible connection was not a miracle, but the trigger for an ancient curse? A forgotten plague that feeds on their affection, powerful enough to turn the very land to ash and bring empires to ruin. He thought his choice was to save her. He is about to discover that his choice is to decide how their world will end. The order was absolute, sealed with the High Council's sigil of silver ash and bound by magic that felt as cold as a tomb. General Lyron held the scroll in his gauntlet hand, the enchanted parchment chilling the layered metal right through to his skin. It contained only 2 sentences, written in the flawless, merciless calligraphy of his people. The first named the prisoner Gorza, of the Shattered Fang clan. The second decreed her fate, execution by dawn, for the crime of existing within their borders. His mandate was not to question, merely to obey, to be the elegant final instrument of elven justice. For 120 years, that had been enough. Today, it was not. A disquiet he hadn't felt since he was a young soldier, 70 years ago during the aftermath of the last Great War, coiled in his gut. The dungeons of Silverwood Citadel were not dank, foul places like those of men. They were carved from living white stone, illuminated by softly glowing moss that pulsed with a calm blue light. The air smelled of clean earth and the faint ozone of containment runes. Yet, as he descended the spiraling staircase, each step echoing with a profound finality, the perfect, sterile order of the place felt suffocating. He caught his reflection in the polished surface of his own breastplate, the impassive face of a loyal general, framed by long, silver hair. The eyes that stared back, however, belonged to a stranger. The scroll in his hand suddenly felt heavier, its magical seal seeming to leach the very warmth from the air around him. 2 guards, their ornate helms hiding any expression, snapped to attention as he approached the final cell. They held spears that hummed with stored energy, but their rigid posture betrayed a tension that was unusual for the execution of a single orc. Lyron dismissed them with a flick of his wrist. He needed to see her alone. He didn't know why, but the need was a physical ache, a command from some deeper part of his soul that defied his logic and his loyalty. The magical barrier over the cell entrance dissolved into shimmering dust at his touch, and he stepped inside. The air instantly changed. The clean, sterile scent of the dungeon was gone, replaced by something wild and alive, the smell of mountain winds, wood smoke, and a faint, floral note of night-blooming moon petal. It was the scent of a world he had only known as an enemy. And then he saw her. She wasn't the hulking, snarling beast from the war stories his father had told him. She was kneeling in the center of the cell, her back straight, her powerful form bound by chains of enchanted silver that glowed faintly, suppressing her strength. Her skin was a deep, healthy green, marked with delicate, swirling black tattoos that told the story of her lineage. Her black hair was braided with small, carved bone beads. But it was her face. When she slowly lifted it to meet his gaze, that shattered his world. Her features were strong, her tusks smaller than he'd expected, framing a surprisingly soft mouth. And her eyes were not the soulless pits of black hatred he'd been taught to expect. They were the color of fiery amber, intelligent and ancient, and filled not with fear, but with a defiant, heartbreaking sorrow. The moment their eyes met, it happened. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical jolt, as if a bolt of lightning had struck the core of his being, silent and unseen. The air crackled. He felt a phantom warmth spread across his chest, a feeling of profound, impossible recognition. It was a feeling of finding a piece of his own soul in the last place the world would ever let him look. His breath caught in his throat. The scroll felt like a viper in his hand. He was the general of the Silver Veil, the blade of his people, a veteran of countless skirmishes. But in that one shattering second, standing before a 25-year-old orc prisoner he was sworn to kill, he understood he was lost. He forced himself to unroll the scroll, his voice a stranger to his own ears as he read the charge and the sentence. His words echoed in the sudden, heavy silence. When he finished, she didn't plead or curse him. She simply watched him, her amber eyes searching his. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice lower than he imagined, like the sound of gravel and honey. They send their finest general to kill one unarmed woman. You carry yourself with honor. What is your name? The question was not a challenge, but a genuine inquiry. It was a demand to be seen not as a monster, but as a person, by the man sent to end her. The simple query disarmed him more completely than any weapon could. He couldn't answer. At that moment, the torches in the hallway outside the cell flared violently, casting a wild, dancing light. Beneath the soles of his boots, Lyran felt it, a deep, unnatural warmth spreading through the cold, living stone of the citadel floor. It was as if the fortress itself was reacting to them, the magic in its very foundations stirring in alarm. The guards outside shifted nervously. They were waiting for his order to take her to the block. The entire fortress was waiting. But the only order Lyran could form was a strangled whisper to himself. He turned on his heel, his cloak swirling around him, and strode out of the cell without looking back. Leave her, he commanded the stunned guards, his voice tight and raw. No one is to touch her until I return. Lyran ascended from the dungeons as if fleeing a fire, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that belied his elven composure. Each step up the spiraling staircase was a step away from her amber eyes, but the image was seared into his mind. He didn't stop at the barracks or the war room. He went straight to his private quarters, a place of stark, military precision. Maps of contested territories were pinned to the walls, his collection of antique blades was displayed with geometric perfection, and a single, flawless crystal sat on his desk, used for scrying and communication. For a century, this room had been his sanctuary, a reflection of his ordered mind. Now it felt like a cage. He tore off his gauntlets, tossing them onto the polished oak table where they landed with a discordant clang. The sound, so out of place in the usual silence, was like a crack forming in the very foundation of his life. He barely had a moment to catch his breath before a soft chime announced a presence at his door. He straightened instinctively, his mask of command falling back into place. "Enter," he said, his voice harder than he intended. The door slid open to reveal Elder Alera, a member of the High Council. Her silver robes were immaculate, and her face, though etched with the fine lines of centuries, held an ageless, piercing intelligence. She had been his mentor when he was a young captain, and her gaze missed nothing. "General," she began, her tone smooth as polished river stone. "A report from the dungeon guards has reached the council. It seems the execution has been delayed. An irregularity of this magnitude, concerning a prisoner of this profile, is unsettling." She paused, letting the weight of her words fill the room. "Is there something about this orc that requires further review?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a test, a carefully placed probe into his sudden, inexplicable breach of protocol. The pressure was immense, a silent demand for an answer that would satisfy a millennium of tradition. Lyran met her gaze, his mind racing. To admit the truth was impossible, an act of career and social suicide. He needed a reason, a shield of logic to hide behind. "Elder Alera," he said, forcing a calm he did not feel. "Upon reviewing the capture report, I found inconsistencies. The patrol's account of her supposed aggression doesn't align with the prisoner's disposition. I will not send a soul to the pyre, even an orc's, if the charge is built on a faulty foundation. I am going to the archives to review the original field reports." It was a weak excuse, a grasp at straws, but it was rooted in the language of procedure they both understood. Alera's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. A noble sentiment, General. But justice for our people must not be stalled by sentiment for our enemies. The dawn approaches. See that your review is swift." She inclined her head and departed, leaving behind a silence more damning than any reprimand. She didn't believe him. He knew it. The Citadel archives were a labyrinth of chilled air and the scent of ancient parchment. Here, 10,000 years of elven history were recorded on scrolls stacked from floor to ceiling. Lyran bypassed the records of recent conflicts, drawn by an instinct he didn't understand toward the older, dustier sections. He was looking for a precedent, a historical or magical explanation for the electrifying connection he'd felt. As he worked, reports began to trickle in from junior officers. The glowing moss in the dungeons was dimming, its ethereal blue light fading to a sickly gray. The nightingales in the Citadel's aviary had fallen silent. Minor magical wards around the perimeter were flickering. Each report was a new knot in the pit of his stomach. It had started when he met her gaze. It was getting worse the longer she remained alive within these walls. He was deep in a section detailing the aftermath of the last Great War 70 years ago, when his fingers brushed against a brittle, leather-bound codex. It wasn't a military record, but a collection of cautionary tales and folklore compiled by a forgotten scholar. Most of it was nonsense, stories of mischievous sprites and grumpy trolls. But one entry, a footnote scribbled in faded ink, made him freeze. It spoke of a forbidden legend from 900 years prior, concerning an elven lord named Valerius and an orc shamaness of the shattered Fong clan, Gorza's clan. The text described their impossible love as a soul-bound affliction, a magical phenomenon so rare it was considered myth. It claimed their bond did not create life, but consumed it, draining the ambient magic from the world around them. The scholar dismissed it as a fanciful allegory for the destructive nature of miscegenation, but he quoted a line from a lost poem about them. Where their hearts met, the flowers did wilt, and the stones themselves wept in sorrow. The warmth he'd felt through the dungeon floor. The dimming lights. It wasn't his imagination. It was happening again. Just as the terrifying realization began to dawn, the heavy oak doors to the archives were thrown open with a crash. A young lieutenant stood there, his face pale with panic, his armor askew. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with a terror Lyran had only ever seen on the battlefield. "General," he gasped, forgoing all protocol. "You must come at once." "The prisoner, she's collapsed in her cell." The lieutenant took another ragged breath, his next words striking Lyran like a physical blow, stealing the very air from his lungs. "And the heartwood in the central courtyard." "General, its leaves. They are turning to ash." The heartwood. Lyran's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a tree. It was the living soul of Silverwood Citadel, a colossal silver-leafed behemoth that had stood for 3,000 years. Its health was mystically tied to the strength of the entire Elven Kingdom. To say its leaves were turning to ash was like saying the stars were falling from the sky. It was an impossibility, a sacrilege against the natural order. Lyran shoved the ancient codex into his tunic, the brittle leather cracking under the sudden force, and sprinted from the archives. He moved with a speed that startled the young lieutenant, a blur of silver and gray armor through the pristine corridors. He ignored the panicked shouts of sentries and the bewildered stares of acolytes. All he could hear was the frantic, desperate thumping of his own heart, a drumbeat counting down to a catastrophe he had unknowingly set in motion. He burst into the central courtyard, and the sight that greeted him stopped him dead. The vast, open space, usually shimmering with the heartwood's gentle, silvery light, was now cast in a ghastly dim twilight. The great tree was visibly sickening. Its luminous leaves, each one usually a perfect mirror of moonlight, were curling at the edges, turning a brittle, charcoal black before flaking away into dust on the breeze. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of elves that had gathered, mages, nobles, and soldiers alike, all staring in horrified disbelief. The air was thick with the smell of decay and dying magic. This was no mere blight. It was an unmaking. In the center of the courtyard, Elder Alara stood rigid, her face a mask of cold fury. When her eyes found Lyran's across the dying grass, the accusation in them was as sharp and deadly as any blade. Without a word, Lyran turned and descended back into the dungeons, his dread now a cold, heavy stone in his stomach. He didn't need to be told the two events were connected. The poem from the Codex echoed in his mind, asterisk, where their hearts met, the flowers did wilt. Asterisk, he had met Gorza. And now, the heart of his kingdom was dying. He waved away the guards at her cell, his authority absolute and unquestioned in his current state of grim determination. The magical barrier hissed and vanished. Inside, the scene was even worse than he'd feared. Gorza was slumped against the far wall, her powerful form diminished. Her breathing was shallow, her vibrant green skin now pale and clammy. The silver chains that bound her, designed to suppress her Orcish strength, were now glowing with a malevolent, hungry light, pulsing in time with the sickening heartwood. They weren't just restraining her, they were feeding on her. He knelt beside her, his military training warring with a desperate, protective instinct he couldn't name. He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second before placing his bare hand on her forehead. The moment his skin touched hers, two things happened at once. First, a jolt, stronger this time, shot up his arm, not of static, but of pure, raw information. He saw flashes of images in his mind's eye, a windswept mountain peak, a shaman chanting over a fire, two figures, an elf and an orc, clasping hands as a wave of brilliant, life-draining energy erupted from them. He felt a ghost of their sorrow, their sacrifice. It was the memory of the original curse 900 years ago, echoing through their shared bloodline. The second thing was far more immediate. The chains binding her flared with an incandescent white-hot light, and a wave of pure force threw him backward across the cell. He hit the stone wall with a grunt, his head swimming. Gorza's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain, but they focused on him with an unnerving clarity. "You feel it too," she rasped, her voice strained. "The withering, the unraveling." She knew. She had known all along. "The chains," Lyran said, getting to his feet, his mind reeling from the vision. "They're amplifying it. They're draining you, and through you, the land." She gave a weak, grim nod. "My ancestors warned this could happen. A soul-bound curse. When two of our bloodlines are brought together, the land pays the price for our connection. The magic in these chains, it's like a siphon, turning our bond into a weapon." Her gaze fell upon the execution scroll he had dropped, now lying on the floor between them. "They want to execute me," she whispered, a flicker of true fear finally entering her voice. "But it won't stop it. It will only sever it. The backlash will be 1,000 times worse than this slow decay. It won't just kill the tree. It will shatter this entire valley." Lyran stared at her, the horrific truth of their situation crashing down on him. The High Council, in their blind hatred, had created the perfect instrument for their own destruction. They had brought the two of them together and bound her with magic that was accelerating the very apocalypse they feared. Killing her wouldn't save them. It would doom them all instantly. A tremor, much stronger than the first, shook the very foundations of the citadel. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the last of the glowing moss in the hallway outside flickered and died, plunging the corridor into absolute darkness. The only light left in the world was the cruel, pulsing glow of Gorza's chains. The tremors subsided, leaving behind a silence that was more terrifying than the noise. In the pitch-black corridor, the only illumination came from the sickly, pulsing light of the silver chains binding Gorza. They cast long, distorted shadows that danced on the stone walls like specters of the citadel's impending doom. Dust drifted down, catching the light like malevolent spores. Lyran pushed himself to his feet, his mind a whirlwind of horror and clarity. The legends were true. The cautionary tales were not allegories. They were warnings. He and Gorza were the living embodiment of a 900-year-old magical plague, and the High Council, in their blind adherence to tradition and hate, were about to prescribe a cure that would instantly kill the patient. The irony was so bitter it almost made him choke. He heard it then, a sound that cut through the ringing in his ears. The rhythmic, heavy tread of armored boots, approaching quickly. It wasn't the sound of 2 guards, but at least a dozen. They were coming for her, spurred on by the chaos, to carry out the sentence before the world itself fell apart. He looked at Gorza, who was now struggling to sit up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The chains flared brighter with every heartbeat, and he could feel the life force not just from her, but from the very stones beneath him, being drawn into them. There was no time to reason with the council, no time to present the dusty codex as evidence. Logic had fled this place, replaced by fear. He had only seconds to make a choice that would redefine his entire existence, a choice between his oath and his world. The lock, Gorza rasped, sensing his decision. She held up her bound wrists, where a central rune glowed brighter than the rest. It's the focal point. Break it. He didn't hesitate. He drew not his long sword, but the ceremonial dagger from his belt, the very symbol of his rank as general, a gift from the council itself. Its blade was forged with enchantments meant to command loyalty and uphold elven law. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the cacophony of shouts from the approaching guards. He held her chained hands in one of his, and for a moment, he was struck by how small they felt despite their strength. He raised the dagger, its silver edge gleaming in the cursed light, and drove the point directly into the heart of the glowing rune. The impact was explosive. A shockwave of emerald and silver light erupted from the manacles, throwing him back once more. The sound was not of metal breaking, but of a high-pitched scream, as if the magic itself was being torn apart. The chains clattered to the floor, suddenly dark and inert, their power extinguished. In the sudden absence of their light, the dungeon was plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. For a terrifying second, Lyran thought he had failed, that he had somehow triggered the very backlash Gorza had warned of. He heard her fall forward with a sharp cry. He scrambled in the dark, his hands finding her shoulders, and helped her lean against the wall. He felt a faint tremor run through her, but it wasn't the curse. It was exhaustion. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice strained. He felt her nod in the darkness. "The drain. It stopped," she whispered. Her voice was weak, but it was steady. "But I can still feel it. Our bond. It's calmer now, but the Citadel's magic is like a storm around it. We have to get away from this place. Away from so much concentrated power." Just then, the corridor was flooded with the harsh, white light of mage-light torches. Elder Alara stood at the head of a squadron of the Citadel Guard, their spears leveled, their faces grim. Her eyes widened in shock, first at the dead chains on the floor, then at Lyran, who was protectively shielding the orc prisoner with his own body. Her expression hardened from disbelief into a cold, diamond-hard fury. "General Lyran," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "What is the meaning of this? You have assaulted a prisoner, destroyed Citadel property, and defied a direct order from the High Council. You have committed treason." Lyran slowly rose to his full height, placing himself squarely between Gorza and the guards. "Alara, you do not understand," he pleaded, his voice ringing, with a desperate urgency he had never shown her before. "There is a curse, an ancient one. Executing her will unleash a wave of magic that will shatter this valley. The Heartwood is dying not because of her, but because we are near each other, and these chains were amplifying the effect. I saw it. In the archives." Alara let out a short, incredulous laugh that held no humor. "A curse? You have been a soldier for more than 100 years, Lyran. And you allow this creature to fill your head with nursery room fables and dark magic? You are a fool. Your honor is lost." She raised her hand. "Seize them both. If the general resists, subdue him." The guards took a step forward, their spears humming with lethal energy, their loyalty to the council absolute. The word subdue hung in the air, a death sentence for Lyran's former life. The Citadel guards, elves he had trained, whose families he knew, advanced with the soulless precision he himself had taught them. Their spear tips crackled with contained lightning, their faces set like stone behind their silver helms. For 100 years, their loyalty had been his greatest weapon. Now it was pointed at his heart. He drew his long sword, the blade singing as it left the scabbard. It wasn't an act of aggression, but a declaration. He would not stand down. He would not let them doom their own world. He met the eyes of the lead guard, a young elf named Phelan, and saw a flicker of confusion and regret before the soldier's training took over. The first spear lunged. Lyran didn't meet it with the edge of his blade, but with the flat, deflecting the lethal point downward where it sparked harmlessly against the stone floor. He moved with an economy of motion that was breathtaking, a dance of pure, defensive mastery. He spun inside Phelan's reach, the pommel of his sword striking the elf's wrist with a sharp crack of bone. The spear clattered to the ground. Lyran shoved the disarmed guard back into the ranks, creating a momentary disruption. But there were 11 more. They surged forward, a wall of discipline, steel, and magic. He was their general. He knew every tactic, every feint, every weakness in their formation. But he also knew their strength was in numbers, and he was standing in a dead-end cell with a weakened woman behind him. While Lyran held the line, a desperate, brilliant ballet of survival, Gorza was pushing herself up against the back wall of the cell. Her body ached with a profound weakness, the after-effect of the magical siphoning. But her Orcish senses, so different from the elves, were screaming at her. The air here was wrong. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone, ignoring the chaos erupting just feet away. She felt it, a faint, steady draft, a subtle vibration that spoke of hollowness beyond. It was an old seam, covered with magical plaster and forgotten for centuries. "Here," she yelled, her voice cutting through the clang of steel. "The wall is weak here." An old passage. Lyran risked a glance over his shoulder. He saw where she was pointing, a section of wall that looked identical to the rest. But he trusted her. He had to. He parried another 2 spear thrusts, the impacts jarring his arm to the shoulder. He needed space. He needed a diversion. His eyes darted to Elder Alara, who stood behind her guards, her face a mask of cold indignation, her hand gripping a mage-light rod that bathed the scene in its harsh, analytical light. An idea, reckless and desperate, formed in his mind. With a powerful kick, he sent a charging guard stumbling backward. Then he fluidly reversed his grip on the ceremonial dagger he still held. With a flick of his wrist honed by a century of practice, he threw it. The dagger did not fly toward Alara or her guards. It flew toward the mage-light rod in her hand. The enchanted blade struck the crystal emitter at the tip of the rod with a high-pitched ping. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The containment matrix of the mage-light shattered, releasing its stored energy not as light, but as a raw, uncontrolled detonation of magic. A silent, blinding flash of white light filled the corridor, followed by a concussive boom that sent everyone, including Lyran, reeling. The guards cried out, momentarily blinded and deafened. Alara was thrown back, the destroyed rod flying from her hand. It was the only chance they would get. Lyran spun around, grabbing Gorza's arm. "Now," he yelled. He slammed his armored shoulder into the section of wall she had indicated. The stone groaned, cracked, and then exploded inward into a shower of dust and crumbling mortar, revealing a dark, narrow opening. He shoved her through first and then scrambled in after her, just as the first coherent shouts of the guards rose from behind them. They were in a cramped, suffocatingly narrow tunnel, thick with the dust of ages. The air was stale and dead. Behind them, they could hear Alara's enraged voice screaming orders, the sounds of guards trying to force their way through the new opening. They had no light, only the oppressive darkness of the earth. Lyran grabbed Gorza's hand, his grip firm. "This way," he said, his voice low and urgent, and began to run, pulling her along. They stumbled through the blackness, their only guide the slight downward slope of the tunnel floor. Minutes stretched into an eternity of scraped hands, ragged breaths, and the ever-present sound of their pursuers behind them. Just when their lungs were burning and their hope was starting to fade, they saw it, a pinprick of gray light ahead. They ran toward it, bursting out of the tunnel and into the open air. But their relief died in their throats. They had not emerged into the forest. They stood on a narrow, crumbling stone ledge, a forgotten maintenance path carved into the citadel's very foundation. Before them was nothing, a chasm, 1,000 feet deep, filled with a swirling, permanent mist. The main gates were a mile above them and to the north. Behind them, The sounds of the Citadel Guard echoed from the tunnel entrance, growing closer with every passing second. They were trapped. The wind was a hungry thing on the ledge, pulling at their clothes and hair, whispering of the 1,000-foot drop into the swirling mists below. Behind them, the sounds from the tunnel grew sharper, more organized. Lyran could hear Alara's voice, no longer enraged but cold with tactical precision, directing her guards. They would have ropes. They would have grappling spells. It would take them mere minutes to reach the tunnel exit and pin them down. He stood with his back to the chasm, his sword held ready, a final hopeless line of defense. His mind, the mind of a general accustomed to calculating odds, saw only two outcomes: capture and execution, or a final defiant step into empty air. Both ended the same way. "There is no escape," he said, his voice flat, almost stolen by the wind. He was not speaking to Gorza, but to the reality of their situation. He had failed. His rebellion had lasted less than an hour. Gorza, however, was not looking at the tunnel. She was staring down into the abyss, her eyes narrowed, her head tilted as if listening to a song only she could hear. She was still weak, leaning heavily against the rock face, but her focus was absolute. "You think like an elf," she said, her voice a low rumble against the wind's shriek. "You see a wall and a fall. I see the mountain's skin." She pointed a trembling finger downward, into a section of the mist that looked no different from the rest. "There. About 50 feet down. Do you see the darker shadow in the cliff face? It's an old water vein, long dry. The rock there will be more brittle, but it will offer handholds. It leads to a cave system the Citadel builders never found." Lyran followed her gesture, his elven eyes, far sharper than any human's, struggling to pierce the thick, rolling fog. He saw nothing, only the sheer, merciless vertical drop of the rock. "Gorza, there is nothing there," he said, the words tasting of ash. "Even if there were, the descent is impossible." She turned to face him then, and her amber eyes burned with an intensity that defied the wind and their hopeless situation. "It's impossible for one," she corrected. "But not for two. Not for us." She held out her hand. "Our curse, this bond, it is a drain, yes. But it is also a connection. I can feel the life in the rock, and I can feel where it is weakest. I can feel the path. But I don't have the strength to make the climb. You do. You have to trust me, Lyran." It was the ultimate test. To abandon logic, strategy, and the evidence of his own eyes. To place his life and hers on a feeling, a whisper of Orcish mountain lore that sounded like madness. He looked from her determined amber eyes to the abyss below, then back to the tunnel where the first armored guard was now visible, preparing a rope. In that moment, he realized his meticulously ordered world was gone, shattered in a dungeon cell. All he had left was this impossible woman and her impossible hope. He sheathed his sword and took her hand. The contact sent a familiar low-level thrum through him, a resonance that was both alarming and deeply comforting. "Tell me what to do," he said. They moved as one. He went first, over the edge, his boots searching for the first precarious foothold. Gorza was right behind him, her hand locked in his, her voice guiding him. To the left, a foot down. "There is a crack there. You can't see it, but it's deep enough." It was an act of pure, blind faith. He moved where she directed, finding holds that felt impossibly small, testing each one before shifting his weight. The rock felt strangely dead beneath his fingers, its innate earth magic leached away by their mere presence, making it brittle and unpredictable. Shouts erupted from the ledge above as the guards saw what they were doing. A crossbow bolt whizzed past his head, shattering against the cliff. They were a moving target, but a target nonetheless. Deeper they went, into the cold, damp embrace of the mist, the citadel disappearing above them. The world shrank to the few feet of rock around them, the sound of the wind, their own ragged breaths, and Gorza's steady voice. He was her strength, she was his eyes. After what felt like an eternity, his searching foot found not a small hold, but solid ground. A wide, hidden ledge, obscured by a curtain of mist. He pulled Gorza down after him, and they stumbled together into the mouth of a dark cave. They were safe for now. Hidden. He leaned against the cave wall, his body trembling with adrenaline and exertion. She slumped beside him, their shoulders touching. They were alone, fugitives, bound by a power that was destroying the world around them. As the silence of the cave enveloped them, a new, terrifying sound reached them from above. It was not the sound of pursuit, but a low, harmonic chanting. Elder Alera's voice, amplified by magic, echoed down the chasm, reciting the words of a powerful ancient ward. Lyran watched in horror as the mist below them began to glow with a sickly silver light. It was no longer simple water vapor. It was becoming solid, sentient, and hostile. Alera wasn't sending her guards after them. She was turning their only escape route into a living magical prison designed to crush anything caught within it. The sight of Alera was more jarring than any physical threat. She wasn't flanked by guards. She stood alone, a solitary figure of immense, sorrowful power. The silver light of the warding spell pulsed around her, not as a weapon, but as a shroud. Her presence here made no logical sense. The cave system was a labyrinth, yet she had arrived as if summoned. "Alera, how?" Lyran asked, his voice echoing in the cavern, stepping instinctively in front of Gorza. "This place is a secret." Alera's gaze was not on him, but on the glowing runes of the circle. "There are secrets even you were not privy to, General," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of centuries. 900 years ago, I stood in this very circle. I was not an elder then. I was a young acolyte, sworn to secrecy, and I watched as my own sister, Valerius's betrothed, helped him and his orc shamaness perform this very ritual. The revelation struck Lyran with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just history to her. It was family. "You knew," he breathed, the pieces falling into place with horrific clarity. "You knew about the curse all along." Alera's eyes finally met his, and for the first time in his life, he saw not a stern mentor, but a woman haunted by an ancient grief. "I knew," she confirmed. "Our council has been the secret keeper of this tragedy, not the orcs. We have spent centuries tracking the bloodlines, ensuring they were kept apart. We orchestrated wars, created borders, and wrote histories of hate, all to prevent this from happening again. Your meeting was not an accident. You were captured, Gorza, because our scryers foresaw your path crossing with his. The execution was meant to be a swift, clean solution before the bond could form. But we were too late." "The sacrifice," Gorza said, her voice steady despite the shock. "You saw them do it. Does it work?" Alera's face tightened, the memory of fresh pain. "Oh, it works," she whispered. "I watched as Valerius's magic was torn from him, leaving him a hollow shell, unable to even light a candle with his mind. I watched the orc shamaness scream as her connection to her ancestors was severed, leaving her adrift, her tattoos fading to gray scars. They broke the curse, yes, and they were left with nothing but each other. Two ghosts, exiled and reviled. They lived out their short, miserable lives in a hovel, forgotten by all. Their love did not survive their sacrifice. It was crushed by the emptiness of what they had lost. That is the third option you seek. It is not freedom. It is a void." She took a step forward, her hands glowing with silver energy. "I will not allow you to condemn yourselves to that fate, nor will I allow the land to perish. There is another way. The original ritual was flawed. It sought to sever the bond entirely, but I have spent my life studying it. The energy can be redirected. The curse is a drain because it has no vessel to pour into. It feeds on the world, but one of you can become that vessel. One of you can absorb the entirety of the curse, taking all of its destructive power into yourself." Her eyes settled on Lyran, filled with a terrible, maternal pity. One life, sacrificed to contain it. The other free to live. It is the only merciful way. Lyran stared at her, understanding the monstrous calculus of her solution. It was a choice he couldn't make. A choice he wouldn't let Gorza make. But as he opened his mouth to refuse, Gorza stepped forward, moving out from behind him to stand at his side within the circle. She looked not at Alera, but at him, her amber eyes filled with a love so fierce and absolute it stole his breath. "She's wrong, Lyran," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Their love didn't fail because they lost their magic or their memories. It failed because they were alone. They had nothing left but each other. We do. She reached up and gently touched the elven insignia on his armor. I don't love the general. I love the man who defied his entire world for a stranger in a cell. Then, she looked down at the swirling tattoos on her own arm. And you don't love a mystical orc. You love the woman who saw the honor inside the uniform. She took both of his hands in hers. We don't need to sacrifice our souls. We just need to redefine them. Let them take the magic. Let them take the memories. What they can't take is this. What they can't take is us. In that moment, Lyran understood. The sacrifice wasn't about loss. It was about choosing what was truly essential. It wasn't about becoming empty, but about becoming something new together. He looked at Alara, whose face was a portrait of disbelief and dawning horror as she realized they were not going to choose her path. Then he looked back at Gorza, and he saw his future. Not as a general, not as an elf, but as a man. He squeezed her hands, a silent, unbreakable promise. Together, they turned to the central altar stone, closed their eyes, and began to speak the ancient words. The runes around them flared, not with a hungry, life-draining light, but with a brilliant, pure, and blindingly white luminescence. It was the light of a new dawn, born not of magic, but of a choice. And in that light, for the first and final time, the world around them felt not the drain of a curse, but the immense quiet power of their love. Their story ends not with the clash of swords or the roar of a great war, but with a quiet, profound choice made in the heart of a mountain. It's a choice that redefines the very meaning of sacrifice. Lyran and Gorza were asked to give up everything that made them who they were in the eyes of the world, their magic, their heritage, their history. They faced the terrifying prospect of becoming empty, of losing the very essence of their souls. And yet, in that final moment, they teach us that true strength isn't found in what we are born with, but in what we are willing to let go of for the person who becomes our world. This journey forces us to look within and ask ourselves a difficult question. What is the magic in our own lives? Is it our career, our past, the identity we've so carefully built? And if you found a love so powerful, so true, that it demanded you give all of that up, would you have the courage to do it? Would you face the void, or would you, like them, discover that the love you share is more than enough to build a new world from the ashes of the old one? Stories like this are more than just tales of fantasy. They are mirrors for our own hearts and the choices we all face. If this story of impossible love and ultimate sacrifice moved you, help us bring more journeys like it to life. Please consider leaving a like, sharing it with someone who understands the weight of a heavy heart, and be sure to follow for more tales that challenge what it means to love, to lose, and to be truly human.